And started. It's time. It's time. We're alive. We're alive. Nice.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Okay. So it is
Saying lo-fi code.
Yeah, you probably want to edit that title.
Let's do a lo-fi and code stream. So Theta. Back away. ThetaWave
Did I
live.
change my mode here?
Glutamate.
My mode is indeed as it was.
Talking about vectors. Got vectors.
All about vectors, embeddings, and encoding.
Boom. I give it 5 big booms. Boom. Boom.
My mode is indeed as it was.
Oh, vectors.
Dude, doesn't that sound good?
It sounds so much better.
Oh, there's still some of that popping. A lot less, though.
It is definitely less. Test 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
Now I'm testing 1 2 3. Now I'm testing 1 2 3. Now I'm testing 1 2 4.
3 2 1 9.
Now we're testing together, where we finish each other's sentences. Testing. Or not, because Jacob's not paying attention.
5.
What?
It's
Did you already move backward?
not yet.
Jacob's not paying attention. Now we're testing together, where we finish each other's sentences. Testing. Or not, because Jacob's not paying attention. The video is desynchronized.
Yeah.
We're testing together, where we finish each other. Okay, so I'm gonna have to do something here because that's way too much latency.
Mhm. Stream status is excellent. So
I think it might have to do with the audio plugin I added.
mm.
Part of what's giving it that nice sound, but causing all that latency.
I'd rather have like a slightly worse sound and no popping. Ugh.
Let me just try bypassing this and see if that fixes the problem here. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Test.
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 Test. Test. Test. Test. Test. Test. Test. Test. Test. Test. Test.
Two, three. Test. 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 Is it better? It also could be that I'm connected to my computer via remote connection, so it's slowing it down.
That's right. That was the problem last time.
So let me re-enable it and then close it. We'll close down this connection and just see how it improves. Testing.
Testing.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Testing. Testing.
Testing. Testing. Testing. Testing. Test. 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 Test.
Testing. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Testing.
Testing. Testing. Testing.
Is the latency fixed?
Test. 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 Yeah. Yeah.
It is.
It looks like it's fixed.
Nice. Testing. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Nice.
Looks like that's fixed. All right.
Cool. Well, then we go to, I guess, go to waiting screen real fast so I can go grab a bar, and then we go back live.
Sweet. See you guys in a second.
If I can figure out how to pause it again, then yes,
see.
we will see them in a second.
They probably, when it when it comes to switching cameras, it's doesn't do it very often or very quickly when it comes to us talking.
I know I need to adjust the settings there and or just build my own and figure it out.
Yeah, that's kind of nice. You can just do it yourself.
What is the? I think I wrote it. Did I put it in Discord? I must. Production.
Turn back on. Thank you much. Mhm. Dude, literally, once we stop having issues, I swear this podcast is gonna blow up, like low key.
If we're able to actually maintain a consistent schedule.
Yeah, honestly, even if we're just like this is good. Like just streaming every week, staying in the
Yeah, it's
algorithm,
not bad.
and the videos do well. So
I agree. All right, let's see.
my videos on YouTube sometimes do well. I'll make sure to always link the podcast and talk about it in the beginning, bring more people there. And then shorts and all that fun stuff. Ooh,
Shorts?
the YouTube shorts.
Oh, I was thinking you were talking about shorts.
Yeah, dude.
I'll make sure to wear shorts, really show off my legs.
You know.
Bring people in.
You gotta have that, eye candy for them.
Oh, yeah. Don't I know it? Whatever. I'm going to do it the old fashioned way. I'm going to log into. That was a high kick. Also, the director was not running just now, so it's not going to change anything until I start it. So we have 3 dumb cameramen and a director that is a little bit too conservative about his directing. No offense, guys. I was not trying to insult you on the camera. I just, needed a vent. I mean, if you don't want to be dumb, then get better. Like, simple solution for that. You don't want to be dumb. Get smarter.
I mean, low-key, that's the truth. Low-key. Low-key.
Hey everyone, welcome to ThetaWave. We are a bit late getting started today. We had a lot of technical issues for the normal,
Honestly,
but like more so than like even
they
usual.
weren't even like technical issues. The internet just decided to
just
stop working.
Just crapped out on us, and we had everything set up exactly how it was before, and then all of a sudden, routers just died.
Stopped working.
And yeah,
They don't
it's
want us to start the podcast on time.
the universe is really against us starting this podcast for some reason.
It is.
But anyway,
it's okay.
Let's Jacob, are we up and running on there?
Oh yes, let us check. Let's go to live stream, and we are good. We are good.
Alrighty.
All right.
Well, I'm your host, Ryan Reed. I'm an AI engineer. I am a neuroscience researcher, as well as a singer and songwriter. And I'm here with my co-host, Jacob Holland, who's also a neuroscience researcher and is a musician, singer, songwriter, and actor as well. So yeah, Jacob, what have we got going on today?
All right. So we've got very late tonight. We've got a lot of very interesting things happening. We're first going to dive a little bit into glutamate, the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter, what it is and what happens if we have too little or too much of it. We're also going to dive a little bit into vectors. All right. Vectors, embeddings, and what was the last one? Encoding as well. So a lot of very fascinating machine learning topics that we're going to be going over, as well as our nootropic of the week. We have N-Acetyl-Selank, all right, which is a proven cognitive enhancer and has some incredible benefits. And so we're going to have a pretty good time diving into it.
A little fun kind of tidbit and additional information here. The nootropic topic that we're going to be covering today is actually a nootropic that is often taken with the nootropic that we're going to discuss next week. So we'll kind of cover both of those in the same 2-week segment and give you the lowdown on both of them. But just know that like then one coming up next week is one that is often taken in addition to this because it has kind of complementary and oftentimes enhancing properties. So they're usually taken in conjunction. Not that we are condoning this.
But
absolutely not.
We're not condoning anything, but you can condone things for yourself and do it if you want.
I believe that you have the right to make your own choices.
You have the illusion of free will to make that choice. Okay. So have fun with it.
Whatever actual control you have.
Yes. Ooh, that would actually be really fun to talk about. Like have a good free will debate. One of us being like a pro free will versus like against free will.
I would have a hard time arguing for something I didn't see the logic in.
You should try it. Because I can see the logic on both sides a little bit. I'm more so leaning against having no free will. But then again, it's just a matter of what it means to exist in a functional universe. You know, is anything really variational and random? And maybe it is, but even then, that doesn't seem like free will in and of itself. So there's a lot of very unanswered questions there. But do we want to start diving into glutamate?
Yeah, I guess we got to, or we're going to get into a topic that is going to really distract us
slightly.
So we're going to have Jacob cover glutamate. Oh, and FYI, real fast before we start this, one of the things that we are going to start doing, I think, is we are going to start splitting up these 2 or 3 hour podcasts that we're doing. We're going to split them in half, and we're going to deliver one at the beginning of the week or something like that, and then the next at the end of the week. Because if you really think about it, they kind of work as 2 separate individual podcasts. Because one segment is more of an explainer with covering some pretty complex topics and trying to make them understandable, and then the other segment is more of a free flow discussion. We do a nootropic topic, but that's like the only scheduled thing that we really have.
Exactly.
And so if we split them up like that, it makes it easier for people to watch, and also gives you a little sprinkled content, kind of throughout the week. So,
and it looks like we're posting a lot more. So that's useful for getting in the YouTube algorithm as well. So yeah, lots of exciting things happening,
And then we'll split those up into even smaller chunks, and then put them
smaller chunks.
Put them out there for the people that don't have the attention spans that you guys do.
Exactly. If you don't take some, maybe some paracetam, that'll help with some focus.
Yeah,
good learning.
Good. Yeah,
some other stuff as well.
Phenylpiracetam. Yeah,
phenylpiracetam. Oh, yeah, that stuff works pretty well. But glutamate. All right, Ryan. So, what do you know about glutamate?
I know that you know a lot about it. No, the glutamate is neurochemical, has neuroreceptors, and can become toxic and problematic at certain levels. And honestly, I haven't done a whole lot of research into glutamate itself and its purpose. My focus has more lied on some of the other small molecules, like dopamine and serotonin and acetylcholine and that kind of stuff.
And those are incredibly important for more complex functionality within our central nervous system. But what's interesting with glutamate is that you can find it underlying all of biological nature. It's found in plant nervous systems. It's found obviously in pretty much in every single animal. This is something that has been co-developing with our GABAergic system. And so it's maintaining kind of this push and pull with this excitatory aspect of itself. And then we have GABA, which is inhibiting it and modulating and regulating it. So we have a very interesting interaction from an evolutionary standpoint with these both evolving together. So let's go into glutamate.
Let's do it.
Is the excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. Now, we know we have like around 100 billion neurons in the brain and hundreds of trillions of synaptic connections. Glutamate makes up a large chunk of those synaptic connections. It's heavily debated right now, the exact number, but they estimate it somewhere between 60 to 90% of our synaptic connections are glutamatergic, which is insanity because in essence, it makes sense, right? Because this is really what allows our brain to communicate throughout all of the various networks because it has two very important functions. It has its ionotropic factors, which allow it to send very, very quick signals to just about anywhere in the brain. And then we have the metabotropic factors that allow it to elongate and also to change its genetic factors as well within the neuron's structure. And so it's very important when it comes to long-term development as well as progressing from an evolutionary standpoint. And so it's really cool how our biology or genetics figured out early one of the kind of the workhorse of the brain that allows it to have such complex interactions with itself. And I should mention, it's found in every single region of the brain, but in the frontal lobe and the hippocampus is where there's the highest concentrations of glutamate. And so it's very important for learning, for memory, for communication, for information encoding within the brain, as well as communicating with these other receptor types or when they need to work and how they work and their modulation. So it's very common and it's kind of fundamentally the fuel of the brain, and it powers pretty much all of your brain activity, like learning and movement and your senses. And it's fairly complex. We don't have to get into the complexity of it, but it plays a fairly big role actually in creating new brain cells. So the basal ganglia, not the basal ganglia, I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm blanking on the name. what is it, the neurogenesis area in the brain, the right next to CA1 in the hippocampus. Creates new neurons in the brain. Why am I blinking on that?
I know what you're
Mhm.
what you're referring to. I can picture the shape of it in my head.
I know, same as well. Well, it's not important. I'm sure it'll come to me later. It's the place. It's very important. The place that creates new brain cells, and as well as it is very important for enhancing synaptic connections and forming new ones because it's that excitatory. It starts strengthening those connections and allows you to do that on a very wide scale. And what's important, and it's very important, and what's also interesting is that too much activity is very bad for you. It can cause the death of neurons because you're pretty much kind of like, you're going to laugh at this, but it's kind of like how when bees ejaculate, they die. They get really excited, and then afterwards they get a little too excited, they combust, and then they're done for. And that's pretty much the same with glutamate. And so you really have to be careful to maintain equilibrium because you don't want too little, is that has major correlations with depression and not being able to actually live a very fruitful and actionable and driven life. And so you want to make sure to maintain that balance. And that is something that is very important when it comes to diet. So you don't want to overstimulate yourself with more synthetic versions of glutamate. And so you have to be very careful. Like if you're on serotonin or SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that can, if you're also taking glutamate supplements, that interaction can be very harmful. It can excite it a whole lot. So you have to make sure you're talking with your healthcare professionals about this stuff because it can genuinely damage your brain if you're not maintaining the correct levels. And so what we want to do with our diet is have various foods like different nuts, like walnuts, pistachios. These have a very nice natural glutamate, and you're able to use it in a way that maintains its functionality without overexciting it. So the main way you really want to get glutamate is through your diet. Because if you don't, and you get it through other means, there can be a lot of potential health risks involved. And it can even potentially lead to seizures, and very detrimental nerve cell damage. So, it's the main primary messenger, jumps between brain cells carrying information that tells them when to fire. And so that strengthens the connections. And what's interesting is that glutamate's job isn't just about exciting neurons. It plays a big part in controlling how excited they get. So it has this balancing functionality, this self-maintaining equilibrium action to it. And so, let's check my phone. So, it's sending these signals, and it's important. It's also very important to, it's helping to, it's what glutamate's, interacting with a lot of glial cells as well, like astrocytes. Very important because you want to maintain that equilibrium, right? And so astrocyte and glial health is really important because you're able to, through that reuptake process, it's also able to take that released glutamate and put it back into the vesicles for later usage. And so you're able to, it's kind of like your brain is able to keep check of everything you need and is going to reuse it as much as possible so that you don't have to constantly be getting this intense influx of all of this glutamate or you to potentially have a lot of health risks. And so it's able to kind of check its own levels and make sure it's always maintaining this safe balance because it's everywhere. It's everywhere in our brain. And if it doesn't have a very complex maintenance system, it's going to have detrimental effects.
The I would imagine that the primary reason for the mechanisms such as reuptake and diffusion and enzymatic breakdown, of neurotransmitters, the primary purpose for all those components is for the maintenance aspect and to make sure that given extreme situations, those neurochemicals don't become absolutely detrimental with no kind of escape plan, so to speak, like no backup plan, to take care of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And so, do you have any questions about it?
You said it's the main. I was checking a couple of things, so there are portions of that I missed out on, but you said it's the main excitatory neurotransmitter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's primarily found in the
there's higher
in the cortex and hippocampus,
or the higher concentrations of glutamate in those areas specifically.
And I know that. Let's see. So it's interesting that it's the primary excitatory neurotransmitter, which would almost suggest that it plays a much broader role than something like dopamine, which can be excitatory or inhibitory, but
Mm-hmm.
is almost more like a more selective element. Is there do you know of any research into whether glutamate is responsible for a lot of subconscious processes? Okay.
Yes, it totally is. And what's interesting is that, it's found in a lot of different places. It's found everywhere in the brain. And so in these places that are more autonomic, that have to do with regulating heart rate or breathing, all of these are using glutamate to do that because it's very easy to send signals using glutamate. Right when they bind to those specific receptors, it's an instantaneous signal.
Which is probably why that would make sense for the subconscious too, because our subconscious usually fires faster than our conscious mind.
Yeah.
And so you almost have like these sub networks that need to like fire on their own and be able to make independent choices and then send the results back to the conscious, kind of the important results.
Yeah.
And that's super, super fascinating. And especially given that would also perhaps indicate a correlation between the amount of our brain that is subconscious versus the amount of our brain that is conscious.
Yeah, I think that
because there's a lot of glutamate.
Lots of glutamate.
And it's also probably partially because it's shorter acting, like it's a shorter it's a faster response and less prolonged effect. So you need more of it in order to be able to keep on using it.
Yeah.
But also you'd wonder, like, is that due also to the fact that there's a lot more subconscious processes than, conscious processes that need things like dopamine and serotonin?
I would say so. Because, if you look at it, if you do a test and you have these buttons that are, like this kind of has more of a serotonergic effect versus dopaminergic versus like glutamatergic versus like norepinephrinaergic effect, they're going to be more likely to pick the dopaminergic or the serotonergic types of feelings because that is what's correlated with a positive conscious experience, as opposed to glutamate. If you excite that too much, actually has the opposite effect. It can cause lots of dysregulations and dysfunctionality when it comes to dopamine and serotonin and all these other kind of more selective, conscious, goal-driven neurotransmitters. And so I think that's also why it's very important, because we're not actually consciously affecting the most of the actions that glutamate is taking. They're kind of just the workers that keep our brain turning, just like in the same way that factory workers kind of keep the world running, making sure that the whole society doesn't collapse. We need them, and they make up the majority of our workforce. And they obviously have feelings too. And, if they are really depressed and not working, the managers are going to feel it, and they're, indirectly going to uh, get an impact from that. And so it's really important to maintain those levels and not have too many workers, because you have too many workers just standing around doing nothing. They're going to cause a lot of mayhem, maybe start some riots because they're not getting enough hours in. And if you have too little, then the whole factory is going to not work as well as it should be doing. And so,
yeah. The moral of the
not everyone can
story
be dopamine.
is not everybody can be a dopamine.
Some of us got to be glutamate.
Some of us got to be glutamates.
Insanely important. I mean, I honestly wish that I was had a little bit more expertise on this subject. I'll probably be revisiting this in the future as I continue to do more research into it. Because it's such an important neurotransmitter, and has just such a deep embedding within every single type of network that there is in the brain, and is being constantly used. I mean, like I said, makes up 60 to 90% of our hundreds of trillions of synaptic connections. And the amount of these that are firing every millisecond is an insanely large number. And hence why we have to use so much energy to keep our brain going, because it takes a lot of work to maintain that equilibrium and make sure that the regulation of all the other neurotransmitters in relation to glutamate as well as GABA is very much good and well. And our brain has somehow figured out how to do that at a very complex level. But what's also cool is that it's very evident and prominent in rudimentary animal models as well. So that's your little overview. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It's important that you get, meat, red meats, greens, vegetables, lots of diverse vegetables. You want aged cheese. Aged cheese actually.
Oh God, I love me some aged cheese.
Yeah, it can help a lot with glutamate as well as nuts. And what's also interesting that I found is that nicotine really excites glutamate.
Interesting.
A lot. And so you have to be very careful, because it can be sometimes really good. It can be fairly good. But if you have too much, it can have a very excitatoxic.
Glutamate isn't a nicotinic receptor type, is it?
It's they do bind to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And
I know that
on presynaptic glutamate terminals.
Right, I know that nicotine can. I was wondering if that just happens to be another receptor that that nicotine can bind to, or if it's actually in the nicotinic receptor class.
I would say it's not.
But we're not sure.
But I'm not sure. So
okay.
That is not an educated guess. We'll get back to you on that. But yeah, that's also kind of interesting as well.
Cool. That's fascinating. I will say that all of the neurotransmitters are ones that I wish that I was more informed and educated on. Like every single neurotransmitter and neuroreceptor that I study, it's like there's not enough information. Like I need more information on it.
It's actually really sad how little we know, and how recently, even like really, we've made big breakthroughs in glutamate in 2018, and that was kind of like the big glutamate revolution. And now it's kind of like we have a more deeper understanding of its inner functionality. But even then, it's really not as intricate as we would like it to be, you know? Even though it is, and we've made lots of progress, same with other neurochemicals as well, or neurotransmitters. So it's looking good. The future's bright. Just, it's like we're kind of, the sun is barely rising, you know? We can kind of see its shadows. We can kind of see the orange that's all popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
I always thought glutamate was orange, you know? It's orange.
Makes sense. I've always kind of viewed glutamate as green, but
yeah, that kind of makes sense too.
It's interesting. I wonder why that is.
Yeah. I think
cool.
Yep.
Well, there you have it, guys. Glutamate.
Glutamate, very interesting. I'd recommend doing your own research into it, as well as talking with your healthcare provider about, you know, understanding what you should do to maintain that equilibrium, and as well as it's what you need to do if you're on other different drugs like SSRIs or benzodiazepines.
And most importantly, don't let your glutamate become toxic.
Exactly. Alrighty. So Ryan,
before we get to my topic, I'm going to adjust that thing so that behind you, so that it can actually be positioned to properly block reflected sounds.
All right. Let's do that.
So give me 1 second here. You entertain
everyone. Let's see. What am I going to talk about? I don't even know. This is.
I can't. You can't.
Hit Bob. Go hit Bob. Bob is not very good. Is it Phil? Oh, is it Phil? Maybe. Oh man, I don't remember your name. I'm so sorry. I'm switching to Phil. Hey guys.
Should be a little better.
All right. So, Ryan, we can talk about vectors.
We are indeed. Though here to sift through my notes I wrote down for myself.
Ooh, notes.
Alrighty.
I'm taking linear algebra in the summer, so this would be good.
Ooh, that's exciting.
And specifically for engineering majors, so it'll be very specific, which is nice.
For what?
For engineering majors.
Oh, majors. I thought you said agers. It's like, what is an ager?
You age engineering, you know? That's a thing. You can engineer aging.
Alrighty. So, today we are going to be diving into the fascinating world of vectors.
Ooh.
So fascinating, right? You hear that word and you're just like, God, that's interesting.
I mean, personally, I find that interesting. Some people might, if they've actually learned about vectors.
I'd say that facetiously because most people's eyes glaze over whenever you say the words, a word like vector, embedding, or encoding. They just kind of like,
right over the head.
Yep. So that said, this may sound a little intimidating to go over right off the bat, but I promise we'll make sense of it, and we will, put it in an easy to digest format, or at least to the best that I can. But these things are important to understand because they often serve the basis of a lot of the foundations of the models that we use day to day. Like they have these as the base of the architecture known as transformers, which transformers fuel a lot ever since they were created. They started fueling a lot of our new models that we come up with. And so you have transformers in pretty much almost every single probably of the large language models that you use in day to day. You're not transformers in those. And so embeddings serve as an integral component of that, and encoding as well as vectors. These are all like kind of interrelated topics. And so we'll kind of go over them in a way that kind of makes sense in order of their correlation to each other. So we're going to start off with vectors, or what you can kind of think of as a data fingerprint almost. So at the core of machine learning, we obviously deal with numbers, but that isn't always numerical. And for example, when we are dealing with text, language, things like that, that is not always going to be numerical. And so a vector is basically, you can think of a vector as like a list of numbers that represents something. And usually that is going to be, that vector is going to be something that is determined by the initial data. And so in that sense, it becomes a fingerprint because they're always unique and they can be used to identify. Now, if you want to kind of imagine it in a context, we can imagine it in the context that it's that a vector could be used in, which would be a restaurant food rating system. So if I were to want to take restaurants and their types, their ratings, their menu, maybe even, and I want to use that information to help recommend similar restaurants to you, right? That you might like. That would need, in order to use that with machine learning, or to really use that in any sort of digital processing context, I would need to figure out how to convert that into numbers. And so what we would do is we would just create a vector of that restaurant with each number in a list representing a specific feature that we are tracking, right? And so you might have the restaurant's rating. You might also include its location or how far it is away from the person. You might include another component that represents its overarching food category, another one that represents some of its meal items, or whatever meal item maybe the person had while they were there. And so these numeric points in this list create this vector representation of this item. And the benefit of that is that it now allows you to compare that data with other data and find similarity. And so you can, for instance, if I were to track the restaurants that you've been at and that you liked, say you went to 5 restaurants that I knew that you liked, and I were to have those vector representations, I can now take an average of the number of features across it, and I could get an average ideal restaurant for you that would match your tastes.
Okay.
And so I could now find other restaurants that kind of were close to that, that ideal representation of a restaurant for you.
So when it comes to the mathematics of vectors, is it assigning a vector that is similar to a previous vector that was found through the data. And so is it creating something new or finding correlations between different restaurants? And so how would you take, okay, this enchilada from this specific Mexican restaurant and say, and keep ordering that and say it knows that you really like enchiladas from this restaurant and it assigns it a value. If you go to another restaurant that actually isn't a Mexican restaurant but still has enchiladas that have good reviews, how does it know that that is the same? If it maybe has a different name, there's other variables that come into play, but still has that underlying enchilada that it knows about. How does it actually assign that value and know that that's the same?
Well, the most accurate answer to your question is it doesn't. And because there are limitations to what vectors can actually do on their own. And so there is a kind of a finite amount of usage and for a vector in and of itself. And so the vector is usually then incorporated into other systems that learn to make use of that information, right? And so that actually is a great transition point into
Glad I'm asking the right question.
what?
Glad I'm asking the right questions. That's really
and before I do go transition there, I want to quickly go over a couple other notes that I had here to mention. Just in case these I end up using these terms later on to describe something, I want them to be clarified as to what they meant. So kind of we're delving a little bit into the lower level functionality here of these, but the dimensionality of a vector refers to its number of components within it. So if you hear somebody mentioned the vector dimensionality, that refers to how many numbers that vector or that list has in it. So if we're tracking 10 components, that would be 10 dimensions. Now that is a little bit confusing, and I've personally, maybe there's a reason for this that I just don't know about. I personally found that a little bit inconsistent with the rest of machine learning because most of the time machine learning dimensionality refers to additional levels to something. So
it seems like you're adding just another numerical value to the list.
Right. So you'd think that would just be called length, which it normally is in the rest of machine learning.
Something like called dimensions to sound cool.
But in this context, dimensions refers to that.
I wonder how would that be represented visually? Because you have like kind of like the magnitude and then the direction of the vector when it comes to visualizing it. Adding another
you can't always really easily visualize vectors. Only if they're three-dimensional vectors can you easily.
True, I guess so.
And it is fun to like design them that way so that the vectors can be visualized in three-dimensional space, but it's not always how it's done.
Yeah.
And so if you really wanted to do that,
good for physics,
you would have to find a way of almost either grouping the components of the vector, or you'd have to create subcomponents in three-dimensional space that were then grouped into a larger component in three-dimensional space.
That makes sense.
And that's slightly out of scope. So I apologize if that confused you.
All right, back to
and then also another term may come up is the distance, which refers to the distance between two vectors. So there are several different ways of calculating the distance numerically between vectors, but we're not going to go into that here because we don't have time to talk about that. But the calculating the distance between your vectors allows you to come up with a correlation and a relationship value.
I'm missing our formulas for that.
Yes. And then also another last thing to note is that vectors can be interact with each other, such as being added or multiplied and things like that. in order to further kind of disseminate that information. All right, so we're moving on to the next thing, which you kind of hit on a little bit, which is that vectors need to be incorporated into something else in order to be useful. Embeddings kind of take that vector concept to the next level, especially for representing complex data, such as words. That would be a good example. An embedding is a low level vector representation learned from data. So it's something that is basically it is a vector that is tuned as models are trained and as more data is input into the network. So we have a large amount of data that is fed through the model, and as these things are fed through the model, it starts creating these vector representations that represent the closeness of an item or something to another item, and try and create a comparison and relationships between things. So if we have one sentence, like say, I like dogs, and then another sentence says, I like God. Those vector representations those embeddings would have those vectors very close to each other, and those would be things that they would learn how to represent properly.
I see.
And but the key idea is that relationships between vectors in embedding space reflect the semantic relationship between the things that they represent, so the concepts that they represent.
So they're able to abstract generalizations that can then correlate with each other for
to an extent. Yeah. Words with similar meanings would have, if you were creating a embedding of words, words with similar meanings might have a closer vector distance to each other than words that had a much different meaning. So kind of on a just to give an example of that, like kind of what that looks like, the red and crimson in vector representation in this embedding would have a closer value than something like red and sunrise orange.
Yeah.
Or sorry, that's probably a bad example because sunrise orange actually is pretty close to red. Than red and midnight blue.
But would they still have a similar similar generalization of color that would kind of be similar in a vector space?
What do you mean?
Like a midnight blue color versus like a red color. There's still that color aspect there that's like
this would be if you were creating an embedding for colors specifically, not for all words in general.
I see. So it's kind of different for large language models.
Well, if you were creating it, this is a kind of smaller specific example, but you could create an embedding that had all words in it if you wanted to. So on a lower level, the embeddings are essentially learned representations of data inputs and the meaning behind this data input. Basically, through analyzing like a large amount of data, the model figures out how to position the words in vector space appropriately, so that the relationships between them are accurately captured. Now, context does matter. Because a meaning for its word can sometimes be influenced by its context. So a really good embedding would be able to figure out the contextual, like a well-designed embedding would be able to figure out contextual relationships based on context as well. Now, just to give an example of how this works on mathematically, and I think you'll find this interesting, so I apologize that I'm kind of going over time.
Oh, no, you're good.
But we're trying to limit ourselves with our timing because we have a tendency to ramble on.
We can talk for a long time.
But to put this in kind of the example of a mathematical representation for you, so I want you to imagine that we have and this is something that vectors tend to, that embeddings tend to be really good at, is solving analogies for things. So let's take the hypothetical scenario of the vector operations. So we have a vector, right, in this embedding. So remember, the vector is a learned representation of a concept.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an embedding that has a vector for king, man, woman, queen, like all of this kind of stuff, right? So we take the vector for king, right, and we subtract it from man, or subtract man from it, and then we add woman to it, and you get to queen. That's how it knows the relationships between things. Because those numbers, when they are the way that they work out mathematically, is in order to get you to the other components.
Yeah.
And so king ends up with a vector that subtracted from man and added to woman means queen.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's kind of how that works. That's interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Now, there's only so much that you can do with an embedding on its own, because you have to figure out how to get that information in the embedding and how to properly
contextualize it.
Yeah, contextualize everything and learn those relationships and whatnot. And that is where we get to our next topic real fast, which I will attempt to cover as fast as I can.
You got
it. But is called encoding. Ooh. And it is the process of converting raw data into a form that the machine can then use in order to learn those representations.
See.
And oftentimes is the method by which it trains those representations. And or at least plays a part in how it trains those representations. But it's kind of like, it's almost like works like a translator. And encoding works kind of like a translator by learning to communicate the meaning across representations. So like you have a person speaking Chinese, a person speaking English, they might be saying the same thing, but their representations of that thing are different, right?
Yeah.
So the only way that they're going to be able to actually communicate is through that translation process that's happening. And so that's kind of what the encoding or encoders do. Now we have a lot of different kinds of encoders. So I would love to go into more detail on what those are. Like, for instance, we have a bag of words encoders, which is a really simple encoder that kind of just essentially converts a library of text, unique text, into a vector representation of it, a very simple one that consists of its letters and whatnot. Doesn't do a good job of actually connecting any sort of semantic meaning behind anything.
You can't really use that to create like a poem, something.
I mean, it's just like, it pretty much is like how similar is this word to another word, as far as like the way it sounds or is spelled.
That makes sense.
And we have a lot of others, including recurrent neural networks and transformers that use their own, encoders, and several other different types, which maybe we could go over at another time. Yeah. But for now, I do want to go over the kind of way that you can visualize.
Definitely.
encoders. So if we imagine that we have a composer who doesn't speak the same language as his orchestra, right? So he can't tell them what he wants. And in this context, the composer works as the encoder. And so he needs to convey not only what he wants them to play, but how he wants them to play it. And so in order to do that, he needs a very specific type of notation. He needs to talk to his orchestra in a way that they will understand. And that can happen in a variety of ways. And that's analogous to the different encoder types.
So is it
go ahead.
Is it kind of like finding common ground between different things that need to be kind of brought together?
It's finding the most effective way to communicate in a way that can be understood by the receiving end. In other words, you can't change the fact that the receiving end doesn't speak the same language to you. So what's the most effective way that you can still communicate with them?
Yeah.
And so it's finding that kind of communication, that communication there. But so the orchestra, in this context, can only play the notes that have been defined as discrete values, like the notes on the sheet music. And they can't deal with vague terms like play it sadly. And so the composer has a melody in their head, right? Something that they want played, a musical idea. And it's full of nuance and emotion and character and relationships between phrases, and that needs to be conveyed to the orchestra. So the composer encodes this melody into a musical score, which is essentially the embedding that we were talking about earlier. That's the musical score. And the score uses a specific system of symbols and notation that represents the different important components that he needs to convey, right? So you're only going to be as good as your notation system that you have, that you're using to convey that. And so you have these different encoding methods that have these different forms of creating the score. One of which might be a very simple. So imagine, like, here's the notes that appear in the song, or the unique notes that appear in the song. That's it. That's like a very simple vector, or it's a very simple encoding representation, like bag of words, for instance. And the next version of that might be by the way, that's like guitar tabs. If you've ever looked at a guitar tab and you've seen the chords that they have listed there at the top, that's like what I'm talking about right there. That's a very simple, it doesn't tell you anything about like the actual information of the song, like how to play it or anything like that. It's just like the simplest forms of unique elements. Then you have another version that not only has the notes, but it also has the order in which those notes appear. That's better, but it still doesn't convey enough for the orchestra to work with, because it's not going to end up the way that the composer wants it, because there's a lot more nuance there, right? And so you have these more advanced and more advanced encoders, such as transformers and the RNNs that learn to create these better and more effective representations or these embeddings of data.
Yeah.
And that's is all to create a more detailed, more accurate translation process there. And so that the composer can accurately convey to his orchestra the full nuance of his piece that he wants them to play. And the more transformers like add things like self-attention to their encoding process that allows them to share details in a way that others can't. Like, for instance, a recurrent neural network takes things in sequence, right? So it's able to modify things based on the context of the stuff it's already seen, but it's not able to go back and modify future stuff. And but based off of past stuff, there are ways around that, but I'm not going to get into that. Transformers solve that problem by analyzing every part of it at once and allowing every part of it to know what the other part is, the important data from the other parts. And so it gives it a complete view at all times of the input data. And so they came up with a really, really efficient way of creating an encoding, or really, really accurate way of creating an encoding. And so that's kind of how you can see how encodings, vectors, embeddings, these are all core components that make the stuff that we do work. And everything else, a lot of times, not always, a lot of other things are built around trying to better utilize those ideas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely does make sense. It's obviously a lot, and probably getting into the details of how that actually works mathematically is fairly complicated. But
it can be. It's not always, but it can be. Yeah.
Because kind of my thing is really I can grasp kind of like up until embedding, and like from a functional standpoint, and then taking that knowledge and using it to create almost like a domain of knowledge just seems it makes sense, but it's kind of like me trying to currently visualize in my head like 100 billion stars. That's what it feels like. When you try to do that, you think of like 10 stars, but then trying to really rapidly expand that is very difficult.
Yeah. So I might be able to. One second. Change scene there so we can both be seen while we're talking. I might be able to help out with that. Imagine, how would you go about figuring out the similarity between the sentence the cat chased the dog versus the dog chased the cat versus the dog ate the cat? How would you go about figuring out the similarity there, and how similar each sentence was to each other? Like, try to imagine a way, given that you take into context the unique components, and you had never seen or had very little experience with the English language and whatnot, and you were trying to figure out things like that. What would that, do you think that would look like for you?
Well, the first thing that pops to mind is to assign each letter a numerical value, and then add that
or
numerical value
perhaps each
together,
word,
or each
a
word,
numerical value.
and then add that together to get a specific output. And then I would look and see which ones are the most similar, and we see that we actually have one that is the exact same value. And these two are, I would infer that these two probably be the most similar because of that. And then I would probably look at the order of the words, and I would notice that there was something wrong with the third one, that this one is a different situation because it's a it's a different action versus that. And even if I didn't know what 8 means, I would know that it would be involved in a different scenario, and so I would have to look, maybe if I had a date, like, if I was trained on other stuff, I'd have to look and see what is most similar to that. I would have to search for it, but I would be able to see the similarities between the first 2 and then assign that value, see that they're similar, and then see the structure of the syntax itself and see its reversal and see that these 2 are just the opposite of each other.
Yeah.
Something else entirely. That still involves those 2 animals, or 2 things. So, I don't know.
So, how would you distinguish the similarity, whether the similarity between the phrase "he went to the bank and sat by the river" versus "he went to the bank and sat," or sat on a bench?
And I'm trying to
And you're trying to
compare
compare how some, because those are 2 very different things. Like somebody going to a bank and sitting at a bank on a bench at a bank building is different, a lot different from going to a bank and sitting by a river. One's a peaceful scenario by yourself, most likely in the woods. Another one is a populated, urban, modern, busy, loud environment.
Well, do I have an understanding of the English language at all?
So, in this context, you just imagine that you are familiar with vaguely familiar, but not enough to hang on a second. I'm trying to figure out what I want you to actually do here. Yeah, you do have it. You do have it. So how do you figure out, dismiss that those 2 are different?
Well, first, I would look at the length. I would say that this one has multiple environments versus one environment.
So when you're processing those in your head, the first thing that you look at is length.
Personally, because I mean, that's, to me, the length would be very telling.
The length of what?
The sentence structure.
Okay. So he went to the bank and sat on the bench. He went to the bank and sat by the river. Those are very similar lengths.
Wait, no, hold on. Well, if you assigned, like I did earlier, assign the numerical value, it's either they're different. And then I think that if I knew what a river was, I would be able to then see that they both have a bank, but one has another element to it that insinuates another action that is different than the action in the first one, which doesn't have a river, any water, it doesn't have another environment, and so I would probably see that as the main component of differentiation.
Very good. That's so proud of you.
Good?
That was spot on. Like you used the wide context difference of two components in this sentence in order to push the meaning of the sentences further apart as a whole. So because because bank or is the same, and you have bench and you have river, which are two pretty dissimilar ideas and are not often seen together. Those two have very wide vector distances apart from each other, and because they have wide vector distances apart from each other and are not often seen together and are important components of the sentence, which is part of what the encoder learns to do, is identify those important components. Because of that, the entire vector representation of that sentence gets shifted apart from each other. So those are two different things. They contain similar components, but they're very different things.
Yeah.
And so they have a wider vector birth from each other than a sentence that said, he went to the bank. It said on a badge, he went to the bank and stood in a line. That's those two are going to have very similar, because lines often happen in suburban populated contexts and people waiting for things, and those are things that we see more often. And so that's what those embeddings are, is like a encoder learning those important features, how important those features are, and contexts, how they influence those components, and shift those numbers so that things with different contexts are farther apart.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And that is the reason why it works, I guess.
Yeah, in order to delve further than that, you would have to actually talk about specific encoders and how they create those embeddings, and you'd have to delve into the mathematics behind it, and then you're just down a rabbit hole and you can't stop. So it's hard to go beyond that without really kind of getting nitty and gritty. But
true, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah,
I learned something new today. That's good.
And it's interesting because it's the same kind of way that our brains learn how to figure out the distinction between concepts ourselves.
I've looked at this up before, but it lies deep within my unconscious. It is not. I'm not able to talk about this very well, but it really is intuitive, because it's logic. It's logical. It's something that humans fundamentally do, just we take it for granted because it's embedded within us. So
we don't even know that we're doing it.
Exactly.
I like the reference there.
Yep. So,
we encode memories while we sleep. We have a version of encoding that happens, and we have a version of vector representation that happens, and a version of embeddings.
We literally have vector place cells, that are giving this numerical vector representation of data and placing it on these graphs, and use that to represent different things, very much similarly to how AI models do.
Yeah.
So, which is really cool, there's a reason why we're able to create artificial intelligence. It's because we have intelligence and we have logic, we have reason and understanding. So we can then take that and duplicate it, tweak it if we need, because there are some different components, different than biological life, but is able to take the same general concepts and do it on a computer, which is just incredible.
I know.
Truly
it's
incredible.
Wild. Yeah. Yep. Do we need to? Are you needing to go and go home and wrap? We need to wrap this up.
I think we should do like a little 10-minute overview of Nefertiti. Just go ahead and do it right now. Honestly.
Okay.
I think we should talk about it, because
you mean fast forward or
did I say
Are we going over color race time or fast race time? We're not going over either today, actually. Those are the ones that you had me confused.
My bad. N-Acetyl-Selank. All right, so we're gonna go over the other.
I knew this. I was the one that wrote this thing out.
I just think it's funny that it's produced primarily in the spleen.
In the what?
In the spleen.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. I finally found something that actually has importance in connection to the spleen. Never had before in my life. That's really cool. So it's a synthetic analog of naturally occurring peptide tufsins, and which is a tetrapeptide, which is the 4 amino acids linked together. And like I said, they're produced primarily in the spleen, and it plays a large role in immune function and has various nootropic and anxiolytic anti-anxiety effects. So there's been some cool research study as well. NIH,
Yeah,
so
there was an NIH research study which showed positive results in humans for generalized anxiety, PTSD, and depression, as well as ADHD. So it seems to have some pretty wide-ranging behavioral effects. There was a behavioral neurology study in rats where Selank was combined with diazepam and was shown to reduce anxiety more effectively than either of them on their own. And this test included the elevated plus maze test was used to determine was to assess the rats, which, for those that don't know, is a test used to assess anxiety-related behaviors.
And that kind of makes sense, like with navigating a maze, there's gonna be that anxiety when it comes to navigating it. And so, and we'll talk about this in a second, but it interacts with your GABAergic system, which is your calming anti-anxiety. So I wonder if there was an influence on its ability to stay calm in those types of situations and complete the task.
Yeah, kind of dumb down some of those excited neurons. So in the Frontier in Pharmacology study, they used IMR 32 cells. So we're talking about cell culture here. The human neuroblastoma cell line, often used in research to study neuronal function and behavior, was used in order to determine its effects on the different receptor sites, and they discovered that it had no direct effect on the mRNA levels of the GABAergic system genes, which are genes involved in the production and transport of, as well as the reception of GABA. But they did discover that it may affect GABA's interaction with the GABA receptors and may enhance olanzapine's effect on gene expression. Olanzapines.
Olanzapines.
I don't know what that is actually.
That sounds so familiar.
I thought I made a point of looking up all those, but
so it's olanzapine is used to treat schizophrenia.
Makes sense.
Yeah, or mania and bipolar disorder.
Then there's a final study done, a PMC study in rats, analyzed 84 neurotransmission genes in the frontal cortex. And they discovered that there were significant changes in the expression of many of the genes after Selank
Interesting.
administration.
So it changes the expression but doesn't modulate GABAergic systematic genes.
Yeah, so it doesn't change GABA genes. It does interact with the receptors, it looks like, but it affects these
expression.
well, it affects these other neurotransmission gene expressions.
Yeah.
So, and this, would suggest that it has a complex effect on nerve cells, as well as multiple of the neurotransmitter systems. So it looks like it's not just that interaction with the GABA, but it's almost the gene expressions of the other neurotransmitter in the brain that is also kind of influencing as well there.
And it's fairly similar to benzodiazepines, but doesn't have any sedation or cognitive side effects like it. And so if you are kind of on benzodiazepines and have that medication, it can potentially reduce some of the complications that it can come with, which I think might be a pretty interesting study to do. I'm not saying that that is exactly how it works, but I would find that to be something that I would really want to research, And Selank combines with another synthetic peptide that is derived from a fragment of naturally occurring hormones in the body. And they're called ACTH. I'm not going to say the big name because it's not very fun to say that. As well as, melanocortins, which is another synthetic peptide. A group of peptide hormones and have diverse effects on the body. And they influence inflammation as well as pigmentation and steroid production.
They also have pleiotropic effects, which means that they have multiple and diverse effects on different systems. So like they basically have a very wide-reaching effect on your biology.
Yeah, and it influences neurotransmitters as like serotonin,
your monoamine transmitter specifically.
Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine.
Right.
So it plays a pretty big
in those small molecule kind of neurotransmitters. Yeah.
And as well as elevates
brain neurotrophic factor.
And so it's helping with neuronal growth and survival and synaptic plasticity, all of these things that are so important.
The stuff that we love here at ThetaWave Podcast.
We love this stuff. We haven't gone over a single nootropic that doesn't do this.
Probably because that's almost the definition of nootropic.
Yeah, exactly. So we kind of have a theme here. We're all about growing the brain, synaptogenesis, neurogenesis, all those incredible things. So
so it also does modulate a couple T helper cell cytokines, which basically has an immunomodulatory effect. Basically meaning it influences the immune system in some way. So that could have potential benefits to your ability to fight off, other.
It's strengthening your immune system function. And some of the other potential benefits, we've talked about cognitive enhancement, elevates that growth and survival, it helps with memory, learning, attention, anxiety, mood regulation, metabolic health, so like weight gain prevention and cholesterol reduction, which is huge, as well as helping with addiction and withdrawal, and can help with some of the anxiety you get from withdrawal, which is probably a very good thing, as well as cardiovascular health. So if you have high blood pressure and
increased brain blood flow too, like that would lead to cognitive benefits there.
Yes, we definitely need that. And what I find most interesting is its benefits on gastrointestinal health and its effects on increasing lymph flow and reduced ulcers, which is something that is greatly overlooked in the health community, sadly.
Yes.
And also pain regulation as well. And so it's like stabilizing these blood enkephalins, and which are natural peptides that act as pain relievers and stress reducers. So it's we can see its large, broad anxiolytic effects. Seriously.
So it's just to recap on its receptors. It primarily targets the GABA receptors as far as its direct interactions go, but it seems to influence through DNA, elements, it seems to influence the other neurotransmitter systems as well, which is really interesting, kind of that indirect effect there. And it looks to have a pretty wide-ranging brain effect as well, as far as its kind of the brain regions that it tends to influence. It's known to affect the amygdala, the hippocampus, the frontal cortex, and the temporal cortex, as well as the connectivity between the different brain regions.
And the amygdala too.
I did say that.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
I'm dumb.
And so you have this wide-ranging biological and cognitive effects that are happening, which is kind of cool. I mean, we don't really see that usually with a lot of things. It's usually targeted to specific areas. And it's kind of like, those restaurants that it feels kind of like, those restaurants that you go to and they've got so many different types of foods. Like they've got like a pizza, some sort of, Asian noodle dish. And then they've got this fancy like Italian dish and all these different types of like cuisines. And you're just sitting there, you're like, you're doing a lot here. You can't be doing all of this, right? Yeah. Like, can you?
It's like, I can. Master at work here. Jack of all trades and a master of all. Didn't know that was possible. But
so a few notes on the on N-Acetyl-Aspartate, NAA, and the neuronal health. Is that NAA is the second most abundant amino acid in the brain, marker of neuronal health. Glutamate, specifically GCP2 enzyme, is the enzyme that breaks down NAA and upregulated in neuroinflammatory conditions, potentially contributing to excitotoxicity. So you remember how we were talking about earlier about the glutamate and the excitotoxicity? Yes.
So we can help keep that and combat that and keep it at bay. Really cool.
Yeah, and then the excitotoxicity obviously has like some wide-ranging effects in the brain as far as inflammation and functionality goes. And so reducing that could have unknown potential benefits. In fact, a lot of the brain conditions are in some way aggravated or caused by inflammation. So that's the kind of down and low of N-Acetyl-Selank. It sounds like a sound effect, like slunk. Like
it can't sound like that. Yeah, but honestly, I'm honestly pretty fascinated by it. I think I want to try it.
And specifically, you should try it with the one that we're going to talk about next week,
which
is
C-Max.
N-Acetyl-C-Max. I feel like Selank is like the dumb younger brother or like dumb brother of C-Max. Like C-Max was like the one that was popular in high school. And it's like everybody knows C-Max. It's like, who's your friend, C-Max? Oh, this is my brother, Selank.
Everyone's like, oh, hey, Selank. Cool. Good guy, but I guess he can stay.
If he has to. We'll put up with him just so we can hang out with C-Max.
Yeah, I'm excited for the future research that's going to be continued to be done on this nootropic. I think it's going to be great.
Yeah. And I wish there was more.
I know, seriously.
Especially with humans. Like, let's get some humans and shove some Selank down there.
I'm down.
Well, not, of course, not non-consensual. It needs to be consensual.
Well,
no, it does. It does, Jacob.
All right. I think so, but so this concludes this podcast.
Anyway, on that note,
we always like to end it on a bang. But thank you guys so much for listening. This one was a we got to talk about some really cool topics, and so stay tuned and keep,
as always, keep indulging your curiosity.
Keep riding that theta wave.
Indeed. We'll talk to you guys later.
See ya.